September 15, 1946. 6:15 a.m. Marcus Garvey Park, Harlem. An elderly woman walking her dog sees a shape hanging from the old oak tree near the park's north entrance. At first, she thinks it's clothing, someone's laundry blown into the branches by the wind. Then she gets closer. Her dog starts barking. She starts screaming. The body swaying in the morning breeze is Thomas Johnson. 19 years old. Columbia University freshman. Pre-law. The kind of young man who carried books everywhere, who asked teachers questions after class, who believed the system was built to protect people like him. He'd been wrong about that. The NYPD arrived at 6:47 a.m. Detective Robert Walsh was the first to reach the tree. What he saw made him stop walking. Made his breath catch. Made him understand that this wasn't just a crime scene. This was a message. The body showed signs of struggle. Rope burns deep enough to suggest he'd fought. His hands bore marks where he'd clawed at the noose. His face was unrecognizable, beaten before the hanging, finished during it. Pinned to his chest was a note in crude block letters. Coloreds know your place. Walsh felt the blood drain from his face when he pulled the wallet from the pocket. Columbia University student ID. Name, Thomas Johnson. His partner, Detective Sullivan, walked up. Who is he? Walsh's voice was barely a whisper. Thomas Johnson. Sullivan waited for more. When it came, his jaw tightened. His uncle is Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The two detectives stood in silence, both understanding immediately what this meant. What was about to happen? Neither of them wanted to be in New York City when it did. Thomas Johnson's mother, Ruth Johnson, received the news at her apartment on 135th Street. She was 58 years old. She had raised Thomas alone after her husband died in 1929. She had worked 3 jobs to pay for his tutoring. She had sat in the audience at his high school graduation, tears streaming down her face, knowing her son was going to be something the world couldn't ignore. Now the world had ignored him by murdering him. The police report filed that morning listed the cause of death as suicide. Not murder. Not lynching. Suicide. A 19-year-old pre-law student had apparently walked to Marcus Garvey Park in the dark, climbed a 40-foot oak tree, fashioned a noose from rope he'd brought with him, and hanged himself, despite showing no signs of depression, despite excelling in his classes, despite having a mother who loved him and a future that stretched ahead bright and full. Detective Walsh knew the report was false. Sullivan knew it was false. The captain who filed it knew it was false. But in 1946 New York, false was often what survived. True was what got you killed. The system had already decided. Thomas Johnson's death would be erased. The men who killed him would be protected. Justice would not arrive through courts or police or official channels because those channels had been built specifically to ensure justice never arrived for people like Thomas Johnson. By afternoon, word had spread through Harlem like fire through dry grass. Young Thomas Johnson was dead. Lynched. And the police were calling it suicide. Bumpy Johnson didn't cry when he heard. He didn't rage. He didn't immediately call meetings or demand action. He simply went to his sister's apartment and sat with her while she destroyed herself with grief, silent, present, carrying the weight of her sobs without trying to lighten them. Ruth looked at her brother after the tears finally stopped coming. Her eyes were hollowed out. Her voice was barely audible. They're saying he killed himself. Bumpy didn't respond at first. He just held her hand. The police called it suicide, Ruth continued, her voice rising slightly. My son, the smartest boy in 3 boroughs, didn't kill himself, Ellsworth. He was murdered. I know, Bumpy said quietly. Then what do we do? Ruth's voice cracked. The system won't help us. The law won't help us. What do we do? Bumpy looked out the window at Harlem's streets below. At the people moving through the neighborhood. At the businesses and churches and homes that existed in defiance of a system designed to destroy them. "We do what the system can't," he said finally. Ruth understood what that meant. She understood it would cost something. She understood it might destroy her son's memory by surrounding it with violence. But she also understood that her son's murderers were walking free. They were eating breakfast. They were going to work. They were living their lives as if they hadn't just murdered a teenager. "Do what you need to do," Ruth said. "Just make them understand." Bumpy stood. He kissed his sister on the forehead. Then he walked out into the Harlem evening, and everything changed. What most people didn't know about Bumpy Johnson was that he wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. He didn't move without information. He didn't strike without understanding exactly what he was striking at. By the time the sun set on September 15th, Bumpy had already compiled a detailed file on every person connected to Thomas's death. The 5 men who actually carried out the lynching: Danny Morrison, Rick Sullivan, Lou Bennett, Frank Dorsey, Charlie Ross. All white. All members of a KKK cell that met every other Friday in a warehouse on East 98th Street in what they believed was complete secrecy. The network that supported them, the store owner who provided the rope. The police officers who looked the other way. The city official who ensured the official report would be filed and forgotten. The system itself, which had decided that black teenagers didn't matter. But Bumpy's investigation revealed something else. Something that turned a crime into a choice that would echo for decades. The 5 men hadn't acted in isolation. They'd been planning this for weeks. They'd discussed it at meetings. They'd drawn straws to choose who would participate. And most critically, they'd chosen Thomas Johnson specifically because he was visible. Because he was successful. Because he was educated. Because everything Thomas Johnson was represented a threat to everything they believed. Thomas had been targeted for his promise. That detail changed everything. On the evening of September 16th, less than 24 hours after Thomas's body was discovered, Bumpy called together the men he trusted most. Not everyone who worked for him. Just the inner circle. The ones who had proven they would follow orders without question. The ones who understood what was about to happen. He laid out the plan with surgical precision. 5 men killed Thomas, Bumpy said. 7 days. 1 per day. They die in the order I give you. They die so that when it's over, every KKK member in New York understands what happens when you come to Harlem and touch one of our children. One of his men asked the question everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. "If we do this, the system will come after us. The police will investigate. The feds might get involved." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. "The system already came after us," he said quietly. "It called my nephew's murder suicide. It protected his killers. It decided none of this matters. So yes, we're outside the system now. And we're going to remind them why they should fear us." By midnight on September 16th, all 5 targets had been located. All routes had been mapped. All contingencies had been planned. Bumpy's organization, which typically dealt in numbers and protection rackets, shifted into something else. Something colder. Something more precise. The machine was set in motion. Vincent Mell was 38 years old. He worked as one of the KKK's primary collectors, the man who brought money to meetings, who organized supply chains, who coordinated between local chapters. He was respected among the Klan members. He was married. He had children. On the evening of September 17th, Vincent Mell finished his shift at the factory where he worked a legitimate job, the kind of job that provided cover, the kind that kept him visible and normal. He never made it home. 3 of Bumpy's men intercepted him on a quiet side street in the Bronx. They moved quickly, efficiently. One gun pressed against his ribs. one hand over his mouth. He was in a car before he could scream. Before he could reach for the weapon he carried. Before any of the instincts that had made him dangerous could activate. They drove him to an abandoned warehouse. The kind that Bumpy's organization controlled. The kind that had thick walls and no neighbors close enough to hear what happened inside. What happened inside was calculated and methodical. The men didn't torture Mel for information. They didn't need information. They tortured him so that he would understand why he was dying. They tortured him so that when his body was discovered, the message would be unmistakable. By the time they were finished, Mel's hands were broken. His face was destroyed. His body bore marks that told a story of systematic punishment. They left him in a garbage drum behind a warehouse on West 145th Street, his body positioned so he would be discovered during the morning sanitation rounds. Pinned to his chest was a note. By the next morning, the police found Vincent Mel's corpse. The medical examiner documented the injuries. The detectives photographed the scene. The note was removed as evidence. And by noon, every KKK member in New York knew what had happened. The machine had started. Over the next 6 days, 4 more men died. Rick Sullivan was immolated in his garage, a message about the crosses they burned. Lou Bennett was hunted through the forest, a message about the terror they inflicted. Frank Dorsey watched his house burn to ash, a message about what they took. Harold Bunny Weinstein was executed execution style in his own car. Each death was distinct. Each carried a specific meaning. Each note counted down toward a final reckoning. Patrick O'Brien, the final target, spent Sunday night hiding in a safe house in the Bronx with 4 armed guards. He thought numbers would protect him. He thought preparation meant survival. He died in a gasoline fire anyway, the note pinned to his burned corpse the final statement. The NYPD opened an investigation. They interviewed hundreds of people. They collected evidence. They generated thousands of pages of reports. They found nothing. No witnesses came forward. No one had seen the men taken. No one could identify the shooters or the arsonists or the men who had orchestrated the coordinated 7-day response. Everyone in Harlem had suddenly gone deaf and blind at exactly the moment they might have been useful to police. The FBI became involved. Federal agents arrived in Harlem. They asked questions. They made threats. They promised protection to anyone who would provide information. No one talked. After 6 months of investigation, the cases remained unsolved. After a year, they were essentially closed. After 5 years, they were forgotten. The 8 dead men were files in a cabinet. The pattern, that every perpetrator of Thomas Johnson's lynching had been systematically eliminated, was obvious to everyone. The proof was invisible. The system had decided something different this time. It decided not to investigate too hard. Not to ask too many questions. Not to suggest that a black man in Harlem had orchestrated the coordinated murder of 8 white men in response to the lynching of his nephew. Because if that were true, it would mean the system had failed. It would mean the official channels were broken. It would mean that when law enforcement abandoned black families, those families took justice into their own hands. And the system couldn't admit that. So it looked away. But the message didn't disappear. Messages like that never do. Every KKK cell in New York received a clear communication: do not operate in Harlem. Do not touch Harlem's children. Do not assume protection from the law. If you do these things, there will be consequences that arrive without warning, without mercy, without the possibility of official rescue. The KKK never returned to Harlem in organized force after September 1946. Not because they were afraid of Bumpy Johnson personally. But because they understood that Harlem had a threshold. Cross it, and the response came not from law enforcement but from people who had nothing left to lose. Years later, In 1963, a journalist asked Bumpy Johnson about the events of September 1946. "Mr. Johnson," the reporter said carefully, "rumors have persisted for years that you were responsible for the deaths of 8 men connected to your nephew's death. Would you care to comment?" Bumpy was 61 years old by then. Still sharp. Still dangerous. But tired in ways that youth never understands. "My nephew wanted to be a lawyer," Bumpy said. "He believed in the legal system. He believed in courts and judges and the rule of law. And the system called his lynching suicide." He paused, meeting the reporter's eyes. "So no. I don't regret what happened. Justice was owed. The courts refused to deliver it. So it came from somewhere else." The reporter pressed. "Doesn't that make you as guilty as the men who lynched him?" Bumpy's expression hardened. "As guilty as men who murdered a teenager? As guilty as police who covered it up? As guilty as a system that decided his life didn't matter? No. I don't accept that equation." He stood, signaling the interview was over. "One last thing," he said at the door. After September 1946, the KKK never operated in Harlem again. Not once. Not in 17 years. Sometimes the only thing that stops terror is the certainty that terror will be answered. That's not me being a criminal. That's me being what the law should have been. But what the story doesn't mention, what gets lost in the legend, is the cost that nobody counts. Ruth Johnson buried her son in a closed casket. She never fully recovered from his death. She lived another 15 years in a fog of grief, her son's face the last thing she thought about each night and the first thing she thought about each morning. Thomas's friends at Columbia University never spoke about him. The administration didn't hold a memorial. The university that had accepted him, that had recognized his potential, moved on as if he had never existed. The 5 young men who killed Thomas didn't just disappear. Their families suffered. Their mothers waited for them at doors that never opened. Their wives were left without explanation. Their children grew up asking questions that nobody could answer. And Bumpy Johnson carried the weight of 7 days for the rest of his life. He never spoke about those 7 days again after the 1963 interview. But people who knew him said the killing changed something inside him. Not his capacity for violence, that remained unchanged. But his willingness to use it. His certainty that it was necessary. He had killed to answer murder. That answer had lasted. But it had cost him something he could never get back. What September 1946 actually taught Harlem wasn't that violence solved everything. It taught that when official systems abandoned you, when law enforcement became your enemy, when the courts decided your child's murder was acceptable, something else had to fill that void. It didn't have to be violent. But if it was going to be effective, if it was going to actually stop the violence from continuing, it had to be absolute. Thomas Johnson wanted to be a lawyer. He wanted to fight injustice through courts and legal systems. His uncle became his justice through other means. And that justice, brutal though it was, succeeded in ways that courts never would have. The KKK never came back. That's not a victory to celebrate. It's a reality to understand. It's what happens when a society tells a group of people, your children don't matter. Your deaths don't count. Your justice won't come through official channels. And those people respond with, then we'll deliver it ourselves. On September 24, 1946, Bumpy Johnson emerged from hiding and walked casually down Lenox Avenue. When reporters asked about the 8 murders, his response was simple. "I don't know what you're talking about. But I'll say this. Harlem protects its own. Anybody who comes here disrespecting our people, calling us names, treating us like we're nothing, they learn that choices have consequences." He paused. Thomas made his choice to be excellent. The KKK made their choice to murder him. I made my choice about how to respond. And now the KKK has made their choice to never come back. Thomas Johnson never became a lawyer. But his uncle made sure that the system that killed him paid a price that lasted for generations. That's not justice. But it's what justice looked like when the official system refused to provide it. The story of September 1946 lives on in Harlem history, not as a triumph of violence, but as a documentation of what happens when institutions fail. When law enforcement becomes complicit. When courts decide that certain lives don't matter. It's not a story to glorify. It's a story to understand. Because Thomas Johnson's death wasn't unique. Black teenagers were murdered throughout American history. The system protected the killers throughout American history. And communities had to find their own ways to respond. Sometimes that response came through persistence and legal channels. Sometimes it came through documentation and exposure. And sometimes, when everything else failed, it came through the kind of message that couldn't be ignored. Bumpy Johnson never got over his nephew's death. Ruth Johnson never fully recovered from losing her son. But Harlem changed. The KKK learned a lesson that lasted decades. And the question that September 1946 left hanging in the air is still relevant today. What do you do when the system designed to protect you becomes the system that abandons you? What happens when justice won't come through official channels? And what price do you pay when you have to become the answer to questions the system refuses to address? Those are the questions that the legend of Bumpy Johnson's response to his nephew's lynching still asks. And they don't have easy answers.